Hi, thank you all for your remarks. I'm trying to figure out how to word this, or what even the question is. But I think it's something about given your optimism or lack thereof about the Common Core, what do you think the public needs to know about it? And how can we support the public to think carefully, maybe, about something that is political and embedded in a political and ideological system in ways that are thoughtful and productive?
Yeah. Some of you may have just recently come from NCTM, where I gave one of the keynotes on a panel presentation with Deborah and Dan Meyer. And given the concerns that I have, I've tried to sort of situate Common Core as a political movement, set of recommendations in historical perspective and thinking about institutions and structures. And in that talk, I talked about what I framed as the collective black. So African American, the students that we refer to in our equity conversations, and the fact that most of the institutions and policies that are sort of foundational and historical in this country, those institutions and policies were never meant to serve, and serve very well, the collective black. So my own view is tinged with a bit of skepticism about this as a political moment connected to other political moments where the evidence has been pretty clear. We've seen some movement in the progress of particular social categories and groups, but to identify Common Core, perhaps the movement, as the thing that's going to, as I said in the talk, move the last to first, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. The evidence is there. When we wrestle, as I said, and repeat what Ta-Nehisi Coates said in an Atlantic article around reparations, when we wrestle with history, we are honest with history around political movements designed to produce equity in our country, whether it's through schools or through policy or some other reform, we see that those efforts are really not designed on the underbelly for what they say on the surface. So while and the other thing is I recognize Common Core as a set of recommendations as not being very new, right? So there's not much new in Common Core. Even the mathematical practices are a reformulation of the principles of the previous NCTM standards. And those NCTM standards, the outcomes that we lament about happen on the watch of those principles, and the principles before that, and the principles before that, and the other reforms before that. So I'm less of a fan, while I can respect the individual certain high points and points of emphasis and stress. When I put that in historical perspective, I understand the situation given the way that our institutions function and the way that they're set up and the outcomes that they're designed to produce. These are not accidental outcomes, especially in the context of equity. So that's my skeptical point of view.
Okay, I'd say two parts. One is I'm out of my depth answering it, and I'm coming at this from living in Tennessee. I would never have predicted the type of political backlash against Common Core that's fueled by outside money and is totally ideological. We have a Republican governor who felt the need to have every word of Common Core read out loud in the state Senate to enter it into the record because he thought this is lunacy. So how you deal with that when you're talking political big money, I don't know. That's one answer. The other answer, I can't talk about the public, but we have had this issue with principals and district leaders. When you say you're increasing rigor, they think your kids are just doing harder sums, bigger numbers, or whatever. And so Charlotte took the lead on a paper, or he wrote up a little PD design we'd worked out with district and school leaders that I believe it's fair to say was reasonably successful, which involves actually taking parallel questions from the old and the new state assessments, having the school leaders work the first problem, asking them what they had to know and do to be able to figure that out, asking the second one, and using that as a basis to try and explicate this difference in the competencies teachers have to support kids in developing. Now, I don't know how feasible that is, but if I was to try and come up with a question, it would take that as a starting point.
I'm of two minds on this. On the one hand, like if I think about something like Williams versus California, right? I think Common Core has the potential to be a tool for equity if students are in a school where they're not getting as high quality of a curriculum as they deserve, right? And they can have recourse to say, these are the standards I'm supposed to be teaching, this is what I deserve as an education. On the other hand, we know that standardization, with standardization comes a pretty hardcore norm, right? Because now we have a way to operationalize what it means to be at third grade level and what it means to be ready for fourth grade. And when you have a school system that consistently disenfranchises certain groups of kids and doesn't give them the resources to have access to those standards and to become, I hate to use this language here, it's coming naturalized in my own discourse, right? Proficient, to be able to really learn those things that they're entitled to learn. Then we have created a system of oppression because we're saying, you're not third grade. You're not ready for fourth grade. So given our current underfunding of schools and our under-resourcing, systematic under-resourcing of certain schools in particular, I don't know. And it bothers me, like I said at the end of my talk, that the main mechanism is standardized testing. The promise of newer, better tests, I have not seen it realized.
So, most of the people in this room and in our community have a pretty good sense of what a large job it is to help teachers and prospective teachers develop a perspective and some insight into what it takes to engage students in powerful mathematics in the classroom. So, knowing that, how do we think about what it takes to get school leaders to have insight into what might be possible for school mathematics?
I see I've got the short microphone. First of all, I want to say what complicates the issue. As we've worked with school leaders, trialed them on and off over the years, you have to take account of what they perceive themselves to be accountable for, which is people called math leadership directors, who are out there in the schools doing classroom visits, having data meetings with them, and so forth. So in order to answer the question about school leaders, you also have to work or select sites where district leadership is aligned. That's part of the, if you like, the institutional niche in which school leaders work. So assuming you have a hospitable location, the thing we focus on primarily, and I think it's supported by literature review that Adrian's just finished, is supporting them in developing increasingly sophisticated visions of high-quality math instruction. Why? Because in all of the districts, and it's their initiative in which we work, they're expected to be in classrooms 2 hours a day, observing and giving teachers feedback. We've done a retrospective analysis, and by and large, that feedback is not communicating appropriate expectations. Other things that are important, we would hope school leaders could do to recognize the instructional expertise in their buildings and leverage that to support other teachers' learning. I don't know if this is beginning to answer your question, but at least...
How do you have the access, how do you create sufficient learning opportunity for people like principals, assistant principals?
Alan wants to answer the question for you. I would say, I'd say what we find is feasible is the most access that's feasible for math is maybe a series of monthly meetings. That's typically in the districts in which we work, how much time they would come together, and we've been able to negotiate on occasions to be able to work with them for half a day. So this relates to the issue of what's feasible, what is district capacity, and so on and so forth. What's feasible in that time to support them in being able to recognize the difference between procedural and more rigorous tasks, for example, and a few particular aspects of high leverage instruction is what we found. Alan.
Yeah, I want to point to a tool that Phil Darrow and colleagues built that I think is extraordinarily clever. It goes by the name of the 5x8 card. You can guess its size. It's an observational tool for administrators, for people like building principals. And it's designed so that on one side is the list of the Common Core standards. On the back side of it is a list of the principles and the standards and things to look for in classrooms. What we're used to is the principal, whether or not he or she knows anything about mathematics, going in and judging the pedagogy. I like or I don't like what the teacher is doing. Here are some of the things to look for, grounded in the principles, but here's the evidence that principles, LES, of the Common Core. Here are the things that observers should look for in classrooms. Students say a second sentence, spontaneously or prompted by the teacher or another student, to explain their thinking and connect it to their first sentence. Look for that when you go in a classroom. Students talk about each other's thinking, not their own. Student work includes revisions, especially revised explanations and justifications. And the idea behind the 5x8 card is that it performs a jujitsu move on observation. Instead of the principal going in and saying, I know how to judge whether a teacher is doing a good job or not, the principal is now oriented towards how are the kids talking about the mathematics and to each other. And what it does is it changes the focus so that it's no longer about judging the teacher, but what the kids are doing, and it affords a different kind of debriefing conversation between the teacher and the administrator who comes in and watches. I think it's one of the most cleverly designed tools I've seen, and if you haven't seen it, Google 5x8 card, SERP, S-E-R-P, or Lawrence Hall of Science, and you can find it. So there are ways to move people out of their normal judgmental stance, and it does work in practice.
I hope I'm allowed to do this. I wanted to just offer a cautionary tale a little bit, or push a little bit on that, which is I think it's maybe the moral of the story that I will tell is maybe that kind of a thing without the visioning work that you're talking about, Paul, I think is really scary and just turns into another sort of meaningless tool, or can. And we've heard stories from districts that have taken up the 5x8 card as a way to support, for administrators to support teacher learning, where what actually starts happening in classrooms is that teachers train students to speak a second sentence, regardless of what that sentence is, and without maybe having been supported to make sense of why. Why is that an important thing, and what are we hoping it does for kids? So I think just, for me, then connecting it back to the vision work, so if the principals are being supported to develop robust vision of ambitious teaching, then then a tool like that can be employed meaningfully. And without that, I worry a little bit.
Well, it's Campbell's law again, right? You know, you design a measure and social behavior will conform to that, you know, and lose its meaning.
So can I add to that? I think that one of the challenges we have in working with administrators is that it's easy to want to help them learn a particular thing and to not live in their lives a bit and understand the tensions and struggles that they're trying to mediate all the time, and where in that system we can situate ourselves to help them when they make those in-the-moment decisions, think about the alternatives that are on the table and what that decision is going to lead to. And I think that the farther up we move the administrative chain, they're not making decisions because they think that I think that we have to realize the challenges that go into all of those decisions and help spend time in that space with them, so as they're trying to make sense of these, that we can help unpack all of the things that are inside of the decisions that are being made and help play out what the ramifications of those might be. And I guess what I'm trying to get us to think about is that when we support teachers, there's lots of work around understanding who teachers are and why they're making the decisions they do and supporting them in that. And I think we have to think about that as we work with administrators and really try and understand and and help them push back, right, on the status quo in ways that are hard for them to do, but they need support to do.
I appreciate that comment so much, Megan. You and I started out in similar work, working with young kids and teachers. And a rule of thumb I think we both learned when we were working with young kids, they might do some very strange things mathematically. It's to figure out and understand, explain why. In other words, understand their rationality, so to speak. And at least for me, it's critical to maintain that rule of thumb all the way up. So yes, some pretty wretched things are happening. By and large, these aren't wretched or rotten people. So why are they making those decisions? Why are they thinking that way? One thing, if I'd had more time, I would have mentioned, I just mentioned in passing, these districts were aiming pretty high in 2007. These are urban districts in 2007. No Child Left Behind is really crunching. At least some of them, the senior district leaders. Why were they doing that? They were doing that because they were aware that their tests were low level, that if kids were proficient, they wouldn't get into college, and if they did, they wouldn't probably succeed when they get there. So these were pretty courageous people that over time, not that I agreed with everything they did, heavens no, but I came to respect that they were willing to put their jobs on the line to do what they perceived was the right thing for students. Now, sometimes what happened wasn't pretty, but these people had courage, and I think about this for myself as I get on a plane and go home to my cushy tenure track position. I've got security. I don't have to live with the consequences. They do.
I have a question about the political actors in these complicated initiatives and reform initiatives, and in particular about parents. And it seems that parents are a very crucial force in, and I go back to the math wars, and I think that their political ways of recruiting parents in one or another direction, scaring them that their children are not learning real math, or reassuring them that what it is being done is what the children need. And I'm just wondering about your experience on how in these political maneuvers across the nation and the states, parents are being recruited and pushed in different directions.
Sure. I'll make two references. One to the talk that I gave at NCTM where I referenced Arnie Duncan's talk on white middle-class parents who are under the context or the umbrella of Common Core beginning to discover, and this is his framing, that their children aren't as brilliant as they thought they were and their schools aren't as quality as they thought they were. So part of the interesting opt-out movement is coming from well-heeled, mobilized, sophisticated, if you will, using that term loosely, middle-class, upper-middle-class parents who are beginning to unpack Common Core in their own way, right? To say that maybe this is not the thing that I thought it was going to be for my kids because it's repositioning them in ways that I don't agree with. So we have to take that idea seriously. The source, Arnie Duncan, may cause you a moment of pause, but I think we have to at least listen to the substance of what he's saying and begin to sort of connect that rhetoric to the reality of, well, who's behind some of this? And the other thing that's to consider is the parents who don't have those opportunities, who aren't in the know, and what's happening to their children when these are also well-meaning parents who have been positioned in relationship to schools in particular ways. So in my own research, I can tell you, the numbers are reasonable, but I can certainly attest to the fact that there are various kinds of responses among the African American parents in the work that I have done with respect to reform, with respect to schooling, with respect to education, and those two things are different, education and schooling, with respect to math education. Some of the parents, because of their own experiences, their own math socialization, their own math identities, for example, have disengaged in ways that are likely to be detrimental. And so we have to figure out ways to sort of get those parents back. Other parents have had the same kinds of experiences, negative socialization, negative stigmatization because of their racial categories, racial identities. And those parents have sort of turned in a different direction to say, well, we're going to continue to put pressure on these institutions, the school, we're going to put pressure on the reform leaders, the policymakers to make sure that they do right by our children. So I think there's a number of different responses. Sometimes parents are enlisted, sometimes parents are pushed away, and sometimes parents step up for their own politically motivated reasons. Some of you know the work of, I believe, Eileen Brantlinger, for example, who was at Indiana University. She talked about the work of middle-class white moms who mobilize and go to work on behalf of their children in particular ways to protect the advantages that those children have. So how does that kind of mobilization meet against the children who might be located in, let's say, a particular part of Chicago, or their parents are not able to leverage and push on the system in ways that they like? So who wins and who loses among those parents and the children of those parents are interesting things for me to consider.
Just say confession first of all. We know that links between schools, parents, and the community more generally are critical. I'm thinking particularly of Tony Brike's work in Chicago. At the same time, when we started, we talked a lot about wanting to include collecting data on that, making that a focus, and we just decided for us it was a bridge too far. One thing I want to say to Danny is parents can be mobilized to put pressure on the schools. I want to say that's in a way the same logic as No Child Left Behind, which was based on let's really put the hammer on them and we see what we get. In other words, part of the rationale of No Child Left Behind, and this is, wise people like David Cohen and Dick Elmore predicted this. It's based on the rationale that school people just aren't, they need to up their game. They basically know what to do. They're just too lazy or whatever to do it. No, they don't know what to do, most of them. These low-capacity districts, the best they can do is figure out how to game the system some way. And these horrific things documented in the literature, or teach to low-level tests. So part of it is, shall we say, incentives or whatever. But other part of it is figuring out how to build that capacity and to support that capacity building. Part of the problem with No Child Left Behind, it's mainly sticks, a few carrots, and no supports.
I want to thank the panel for things that I appreciate and resonate with a great deal, but I find it difficult to put it all together. So from Danny, I'm hearing a pretty strong indictment of a lot of educational research and reform efforts and policy. And my question to you is, how does the work that Paul Cobb described fit into your scheme of things?
So I don't want my position or positions to be interpreted as sort of the fatalistic, there's nothing we can do. We have the system that we have. We've inherited it. We have to deal with it, and we have to find ways to, as someone at UCLA recently said, crack the nut from the inside and the outside. So to the degree that we can find ways or levers of change in the current system to do what it takes, whether it's working with school leaders, working in individual classrooms, working through PD, we have to continue to do that. We just can't throw our hands up and say, give up. But we also have to take a very critical look at that system, not to indict, but to be honest about how that system works, how it functions, who it functions for, who benefits, who loses. And we have to develop perhaps some newer strategies based on that understanding. So not to give up on that system, for example. What are we learning when people, I wouldn't say abandon, but what are we learning when people move outside this system and try to do things differently? So Carol Lee schools, for example, in Chicago. What are those schools doing differently with, to some degree, an Afrocentric perspective? What are the Chinese schools doing, for example, when they require children, in many cases from the family point of view, require children to attend Chinese and Jewish schools on the side, if you will? Why does that actually happen? Why does that play out? What's the commentary about the system when we work outside the system to do something different? So I think we have to look at it from the inside out. We have to continue to work and be diligent about the system that we've inherited and try to work for change and social justice and equity. But again, we have to be honest about the history of that system to say it really wasn't set up. Public education in the U.S. was not set up to serve many of the children that we're talking about who are at the bottom, so to speak. That's an honest statement. That's an honest reflection of history. We have to be serious about that. So it sounds fatalistic. So I appreciate the work that Paul is doing, and certainly I want that work to get some traction and have some success, and we have those data points to point to. But what I mentioned earlier was that when you have an oppressive system where you make one positive change, the nature of systems is that they morph and they change in other ways. So if we follow through on a thought experiment, let's say we did all these wonderful things and got these kids where they needed to be, let's see on the assessment side, I could guarantee you that the assessments would eventually change because those kids aren't supposed to be the kids at the top, right? The system will morph and change. And we've seen that there's some international examples of where that's actually happened. David Gilbourne talks about situations in the UK where unexpectedly the black learners in particular context there managed to do really, really well on one of the assessments and they came out on top. And what was the response of the system? It was to change the assessment because that was not what was expected. So mine is more, well, not more, but mine is my own honest rendering of the system when I sort of situate it in the context of other things that I know about our society and how we've gotten to where we are now.
I would say that my little tilting at windmills hope, and it's really like not on many people's agenda is like a good strategy, but it's what I said at the end about where I see these sort of versions of thoughtful noncompliance, people resisting the system. It's because they understand teaching and learning in a much deeper way. So again, I know I sound foolish saying this because nobody believes this except maybe Deborah, but I think if we do a really good job preparing teachers to understand what it means, and maybe Megan and Elham too, if we do a really good job preparing new teachers to get like what it means to teach so kids can understand, like maybe we could get like some grassroots mobilization. I don't know, but there's got to be some way. But because Elham and I both have had these experiences of working with teachers and seeing them change and seeing them grow and seeing them see the lights turn on in kids' eyes. And that is really a powerful thing. And I don't know what we need to do to document that, to show that, the power of that. But man, it's like magic. And if people understood that, I don't know, I'm a big sap.
I want to challenge you to take it up a level.
Sure.
It's you or Elham working with those teachers. What can you do to support district people to do that? That's much more compelling.
Right. Well, so in Elham's session today, I guess this is why it's a panel, right? We talk, panel discussion. In Elham's session today, I mean, one of the things that came out was that we don't have good theories of teacher learning. When we debate teacher education at the level of activity. Well, should we have residency programs? Or should we do this? Or should we do that? Is this kind of PD good? It doesn't matter if we don't know what that learning looks like. So I think that if you take what Susan Giroux recently wrote about that scale needs to be thought about as like the preservation of meaning across broader spaces, right? How do you preserve that meaning without that deep understanding? And one of the things we've seen in the MISS project, and Paul, you've sometimes called it a recalibration, right? When we've used these measures that Paul described in his talk to really kind of see where the expertise lies in these districts, it's kind of sad. Like there's not a lot of folks out there who'd be able to pick up a tool like TrueMath and make hay with it in any kind of way. There's a lot of people, like Paul said, who really care, but they don't have that deep vision. So I think we need to become more articulate. We need to share that work in more powerful and coherent ways and really support people and understand how people grow into that better so that we can share that part of it too. Okay. I thought.
Thank you. Actually, we're unfortunately out of time, but please thank our wonderful speakers for such an enriching discussion.